the first question one has to ask in terms of composting is, why do you compost? And I quote here from Tusser of 1557, who said, "One acre well composted is worth acres 3." Acre, of course, being acres in modern terms. Even back then, and probably for a long period before 1557, people were using fertilizer in some form or another to grow crops. Agriculture has been around for some 10,000 years. So why compost? Well, because it improves the soil. What is compost? That's the next question. Well, it's the accumulation of vegetable waste, i.e. material that you don't want or that you can't eat, formed into a pile and kept at a moisture where it's often referred to as a squeezed out sponge. Given a bit of time, sometimes as little as 6 weeks, often as long as 3 months, you finish up with a well-crumbled compost that is rich in nutrients and other organics to foster growth. The first thing about composting is to dispel the myths that surround it, that it has to be difficult and so on and so forth. It's not difficult. It's not really time-consuming. Yes, you need to do a little bit from time to time, as you'll see, but it's not terribly time-consuming. Does it require a scientific background? No. And does it cost a lot of money? No. So there is we're often running here because there are no real myths. The uncertainties, can I do this? Well, if you can boil water, you can make compost. So what do you need? What you need is, first of all, to be committed to rot. There are some people who are into rot, there are some people who are not. You need a little patience, because rotting takes time. A little common sense, and that is mostly to do with whether the pile is too wet or too dry. You need to have a willingness to separate kitchen waste into strictly vegetation material versus meat and fish and so forth. Meat and fish just attract rodents such as skunks and raccoons and occasionally bears to your pile. You don't need that. So strictly vegetation. The only thing that does go in there quite happily is eggshells. You need to have a willingness to chop it up a little bit, especially your non-edible garden vegetation, the bean stalks, all the stuff that you didn't harvest as a crop. That all goes into composting. That is the beauty of composting, is that you're not left with a whole pile of material that has to be either put at the end of the driveway or burnt or some other way of disposing of it. Nature's going to dispose of it, and you're going to put it back on the garden. You need a container to hold your pile of wannabe compost, and preferably you need 2, or in fact I prefer 3. There are 2 things that you absolutely have to have, and one of them is air, and that fortunately is free, but it has to be made available to all parts of the pile, and we'll come to why that is necessary in a little bit. But you incorporate air when you build the pile, and the way of incorporating air later on is simply to turn the pile. This is where the work comes in. And then the second thing is water. Well, for the most part, We can rely on rainfall for that, but when you build the pile initially, if material is too dry, you may have to add a little bit of water from a watering can. The other thing which you should have is sunshine. Sunshine gives you heat, and that increases the rate of decomposition, because decomposition is essentially a chemical process. But at the same time, when you have heat, you are going to tend to increase the rate of drying, and so one has to be aware that too much sun is going to cause you to possibly have to add water. So let's add it. How do we do this? It always helps to plan ahead. You want to stockpile your green kitchen waste in a container, ideally next to your compost bin. It gives you the opportunity of getting exercise from the kitchen down to the bottom of the garden. Usually you let this accumulate over winter, because nothing rots in winter, so you put it in your container, and we'll leave that until the spring when we're going to build a pile. One can bag leaves in the fall instead of putting them at curbside, and simply put them into plastic bags or paper bags, as the city now demands, and you just store them for next spring when you're going to build your pile. The important thing with leaves is to use leaves that are going to decompose easily. Maple leaves follow that path, and another kind of vegetation or leaves that are commonly available in the city is European linden, which lines many streets. You want to avoid things like evergreen needles and birch and poplar. They are acidic, and they just don't decompose very well. So let's take a look at the life and the death of a compost pile. This is an example taken from my own backyard, but whether or not one is composting domestically or one is composting for a community garden, the only difference really is one of scale. In a household of two, you only collect a certain amount of kitchen waste. When you have a a community garden with many people involved, they can all store their kitchen waste, and then it can be essentially donated to the cause when you build your compost. So that black bin is the one in which I store our kitchen waste over the course of the winter. And in the spring, it looks like this, quite disgusting and slimy, but lots of nutrients in there, and because it is wet and slimy, that's going to add moisture to the pile, which is good. There are three bins in a row, the far one being the one which had the kitchen waste. The middle one is empty, and the one closest to us has got the undecomposed material from last year's compost pile. And when the compost is formed and are ready for use, there is always some material which does not finish up having decomposed. So you run it through a sieve, and the material that doesn't go through a sieve, you just simply stockpile for the next pile of compost that you're going to make. The important thing is in building the pile that you want to do so in layers. It's like a chocolate layer cake. So here, the start of a pile with last year's undecomposed material, and then some sugar maple leaves. It's best if you can run over those with a lawnmower in the fall before you bag them. I tend to be lazy and don't do that, but certainly if you divide it up as finely as you can, then it doesn't tend to mat down so much. And then the kitchen waste on top of that. Lots of moisture, lots of nutrients. And so you continue. So in layer by layer, the undecomposed material, more leaves, more kitchen waste, more undecomposed material, etc., etc., until the bin is full. Notice that the material is level with the sides of the bin. Because I happen to be a scientist, I have access to a digital thermometer which can help tell us what is going on in the pile. So that wand is pushed down into the middle of the pile, and the little meter there is going to tell us our temperature. So the day that the pile was formed, it was 13.9 degrees, and that was probably the air temperature at the time. On day 2, notice already that the pile has diminished in size, simply because when you build the pile, everything is nice and fluffed up like a pillow, but then it begins to sink by its own weight. But on day 2, we're already gone from 13 degrees up to nearly 25. Day 3, 40 degrees. Day 5, 52.3. And that's what you are looking for in composting, is that you get the heat liberated by the decomposition process by bacteria that thrive on high temperatures. But those high temperatures are also eventually their death. And so once you have reached that sort of temperature, you find that within a few days, this is day 10, that you're down to 42.3. Notice, however, we go back, that the pile is now probably only 2/3 the size that it was when you began. And this is on day 13, and now the temperature is 33.8. It's time to turn. And so you then turn the pile into another bin. This is the temperature trace that we've just been seeing, the very rapid rise in temperature to a peak at around 52, 53 degrees, and then that gradual decline as the bacteria die off. So now it's time to turn, and you have an empty bin adjacent to the one that you filled. And now in turning, what happens is that you introduce air again, which allows the bacteria to start to continue their decomposition. And you see this in this particular graph. When we turn the compost, things have to stabilize for a little bit, for a day or two, and then the temperature begins to rise again, but it never gets back up to the 52, 53 degrees that we had initially. That's after a month and 2 or 3 days. And by now, most of the composting is done. You turn the pile, and within another 2 or 3 weeks, you have that squeezed out sponge material that is crumbly and moist, and where none of the vegetation is recognizable anymore. That is the material that you want to put on your garden. For at the community garden level, it is sometimes very hard to get enough kitchen waste. If you have access to somebody with lakefront property, you should try and coerce them into letting you collect all the weed that washes up on the shoreline in the fall. Ducks and geese tend to pull up the vegetation that is rooted on the bottom of the lake. And that vegetation, incidentally, is growing very, very well for the simple reason that a lot of folks like to live beside lakes, like to fertilize their lawns. That fertilizer finishes up in the lake, which feeds the lake vegetation, which eventually then comes ashore loaded with nutrients. So your neighbors along the lake fertilize their lawn, which in turn provides you with a source of fertilizer that you never had to pay for. This is a bonus. The typical model for a compost bin, this one was originally from New Zealand, and it is the one which we have adopted at the Delki Dozy Garden, and it is one that is being proposed for other community gardens in Sudbury. There are three bins ready, all empty and ready for the fall's pile of compost. The big heap on the blue top is all the vegetation that was not harvested. So this is bean stalks and tomato stalks, and we also had sunflowers and just tore off all the leaves. We had corn and tore off all the leaves. All of that to be used in the process of building a pile. In the plastic bags are the sievings from the previous year's compost that did not decompose, and then also several bags of water weed that I had collected from that shoreline that you saw in a few slides back. And so alternating the pile from the new vegetation, the vegetation that had been taken off the beds at the end of the summer, the material from the lake, some bagged leaves, and then also the material which had not been which had not decomposed the previous year, will alternately lay it until the compost bin was full. And there it is, almost to the top, having consumed all the material that was taken off the beds a week or two previously. For this particular pile, it is now under snow, and its next date with Destiny will be once the frost is out of the ground, and we will then turn that particular pile into an adjacent bin, and then the process of composting will begin in earnest. So that by the time, quite possibly by the time that one is beginning to plant, there could well be compost from this bin. If not, then it will be to be applied in the fall before winter. A good source, if one can find it, is a little book called Let It Rot. This, as is the case with so many good books, is no longer in print, but is probably available as a second-hand copy through either Amazon or through the American Book Exchange. And that's all there is to composting.